Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything.
Hey, welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Katie, and today we move into 2 Thessalonians together in our year-long study of the New Testament. Today, we are in 2 Thessalonians 1. As always, you can follow along with the Behold studies in the Daily Grace Co shop or with the reading plan linked in the show notes. Let's spend some more time with the Thessalonian church. As we read in 1 Thessalonians, this church is experiencing persecution. From a human lens, this church has a lot of obstacles standing in the way. They are being persecuted, they are a young church, and we will learn in 2 Thessalonians that false teaching is infiltrating the doctrine of new believers. Paul writes in 2 Thessalonians soon after he writes his first letter. We know this because the chapter begins with a greeting from Paul, Silas, and Timothy, just as 1 Thessalonians did. Paul's team is still together in ministry. Also, one of the problems that he addresses in the first letter is clearly still a problem here in the second. The close turnaround in the second letter clues us into the urgency of Paul's writing here, his desire to clear up false teachings that will threaten the Thessalonians' ability to endure persecution with hope. So, what is this false teaching? False teaching was spreading within the Thessalonian church that Christ's second coming had already happened. The Thessalonians' future hope would be non-existent, that they were laboring, enduring persecution for nothing. And this teaching was falsely attributed to Paul. Now do you see why Paul writes in such urgency? In 2 Thessalonians, Paul will combat this heresy and encourage the Thessalonians that their hope is indeed intact. Christ will indeed return, deliver justice for evil, and usher them into an eternity with peace. We will see Paul combat this false teaching largely in chapter 2, but before he gets there, Paul encourages the church. Paul is seeing answered prayers come to fruition in the Thessalonians. In 1 Thessalonians 3:12, Paul prays that the Lord would cause them to increase and overflow with love for one another. And in 2 Thessalonians 1:3, Paul affirms that this is happening within the Thessalonian body. They are increasing in love for one another, even amidst persecution, and for that reason, Paul deems their faith as real. He sees the fruit of their faith that he is confident is coming from God's work within them, despite challenges rising up within the church. And for this reason, they are an inspiration for other churches in their day. Paul is confident that the Thessalonians will be counted worthy of God's kingdom. Their suffering is not in vain. Indeed, God is using it to strengthen their faith. I love what commentator James Grant says about the suffering of the Thessalonian church. He says that God has designed suffering to work for us and not against us. He has designed it to change us, to consume our dross and refine our gold. He will supply his all-sufficient grace through the fiery trials of life, and those trials are actually evidence that God is for us and not against us. Did you catch that? God refines us. He transforms us little by little into the image of Christ through suffering. Suffering is useful, even good for us. Doesn't that seem contrary to human wisdom? Human wisdom tells us that suffering is the reason to believe that God doesn't care for us. But godly wisdom reminds us that God will indeed use suffering we face for his glory and our good. What a wonderful encouragement that no tears we cry are wasted. Not only are no tears wasted, but Paul points the Thessalonians to their end game. That God is just in his wrath, and one day he will repay trouble to those who are troubling his people, and he will provide his own with relief. Take a moment to put yourselves in the shoes of the Thessalonians. The temperature of persecution is rising against you. Every day you are faced with the gnawing question, is this worth it? And then you remind yourself of your coming hope. One day, Jesus will be revealed from heaven in blazing fire with his powerful angels. He will punish evil. All threats against you will be silenced, and you will be safe. Revelation 21 teaches that every tear will be wiped from the eyes of God's children. There will be no more death, no more crying, no mourning or pain. We will meet Jesus face to face, and we will marvel at him together with our brothers and sisters in the faith. To the persecuted Christians, discouraged by false teaching, the truth of Christ's sure second coming is like medicine to their souls. They are not forgotten. Indeed, they are kept in Christ. As Paul points them to the hope in their future, he also anchors them in prayer for their faithfulness for today. Paul prays that God would continue to make them worthy of his calling. Paul prays for their sanctification, that God would answer their prayers and show his goodness through their deeds of the faith. It's obvious that Paul loves this church. He cares for their well-being. And though they are newer to the faith, he is encouraged by their perseverance. Paul is not only giving wisdom to this church, they are refreshing Paul with their increasing faith. If Paul ever needed to see evidence of God at work, he could look to this new church. Tomorrow, Paul will counter these false teachings being attributed to him and further encourage the Thessalonians that Christ is yet to come. Before we leave today, let's behold Christ together. In today's chapter, Paul shares that Christ will be revealed from heaven in blazing fire with his powerful angels. Christ was gentle and lowly on earth, and he is gentle and lowly towards repentant sinners. But he is fierce and powerful toward evil. This is an encouragement for us today. As we face trials in our own life, as we see media poking fun at Christians, as we see wars rage and discouraging news, we can be reminded that Jesus is greater. All of his enemies will one day be made his footstool. He has triumphed over the grave, and he has conquered the world. We can look in faith beyond our circumstances, just like the Thessalonians. We can find our comfort in the truth that he is coming back for his people. See you tomorrow for 2 Thessalonians 2. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.